modern organization. Park's tasks were highly specialized. They were mandated only to design technology without being empowered to influence the promotion, development, manufacturing, or marketing of that technology. When they tried to advocate their vision, they confronted resistance from a rigid hierarchic structure in which decision-making was localized. Because of a leadership focus on dominating a mass global market, there was an aversion to any risk that might weaken that goal. Xerox's cultural leaders believed investing large amounts of time and capital in a long-term goal with an uncertain return was simply unacceptable. As such, the organizational narratives they enacted had an anesthetic quality, primarily on other divisions, but eventually on Park itself, as evidenced by the defection of many of its members to Apple and other computer manufacturers. Whether there was a direct attempt to sabotage the Alto project or its failure was due to a risk-adverse culture that left it to wither and die, the end result was the same. Like Egypt, Xerox continues to survive. But the legacy of the computer revolution is now attributed to names like Jobs and Gates instead of McCallum or Wilson. Doctors Jackie and Kevin Freiberg, in their book Nuts, use several years' worth of field research, employee surveys, and approximately 100 interviews to tell the story of a very different kind of organization. At the same time Xerox held dominion over the world of office communications, and Joe Wilson and McCallum were articulating their notions of an architecture of information, Herb Kelleher spent 1967 attempting to establish a new airline, filing papers of incorporation and applications to fly with Texas government agencies. 4 years later, in June 1971, Southwest Airlines began commercial flights, 1 year after Xerox opened the Park facility. From the beginning, Southwest Airlines was taking risks by ignoring the success formulas of the giant airlines. Instead of creating hub airports through which flights were routed, they created a strategy of serving customers with simple point-to-point service. Whether or not they define themselves as a postmodern organization, their genesis embodied many of the characteristics from our model. Southwest Airlines created an organization that focused on refining a niche instead of achieving market domination. Traditional market philosophy sees a world of market scarcity over which companies struggle in head-to-head competition. Rather than rapid growth, their path to profitability was directed at always cutting costs. By establishing profit through hyper-efficiency, Southwest Airlines believed it would be well situated to expand in a concentrated and strategic manner as opportunities presented themselves. In other words, to an extent, Southwest Airlines lets the market, more than bureaucratic hierarchy, determine its structure. One example of their hyper-efficiency is the amount of time it takes to turn around one of their planes from arrival at the gate to departure, including cabin cleanup, refueling, unloading and reloading passengers and baggage. Southwest Airlines manages to achieve an average 20-minute turnaround, which is half the industry standard, allowing them to own and operate 35 fewer planes than they would if they needed the average 40 minutes of most other airlines. One of the strategies for achieving this is establishing a diffusion of tasks. Pilots, baggage handlers, flight attendants, ground maintenance all collaborate to get the plane turned around, doing whatever needs to be done, rather than for simply waiting for a task that fits a specific job description. Let's examine some of the examples of the anesthetic atmosphere enacted within Southwest Airlines that could inspire members to take creative risks that contribute to productivity. Within organizational narratives, CEOs often take on a mythic role, and Southwest Airlines' Herb Kelleher plays his part well. Kelleher establishes empathy with members by experiencing their social spaces. On the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the busiest day of the year for United States airline industry, Kelleher once spent a 16-hour shift manning the phones in the reservation department. When an aviation maintenance company informed Southwest Airlines of a copyright infringement regarding use of the advertising slogan, "Just Plain Smart," Kelleher and the other company's chairman arm wrestled for the rights to use it instead of going to court. It was billed as the Malice in Dallas, held in a crowded arena and highly publicized. Kelleher lost, but both sides agreed to share use of the slogan and to donate the saved court costs to charity. Of course, it was sophisticated public relations, but it also sent an informal message to the organization members that Southwest Airlines supported an aesthetic dimension of play and inventiveness. Like other postmodern organizations, Southwest Airlines has a strategically ambiguous mission: to deliver outrageous customer service by doing whatever it takes. The ambiguity of this message can inspire and empower, or justify complacency, depending on what individuals make that mean. Thus, there needs to be a pool of great candidates to fill the ranks of the organization and internalize the risk-taking aesthetic of the Southwest Airlines narrative. As part of a strategy for nurturing a culture of laughter and grace, Southwest Airlines' first step is hiring for attitude and training for skills. They accomplish this by inviting applicants to wear Bermuda shorts to a day-long screening process and monitoring their response, asking them to make presentations to a group, and then analyzing how they behave towards other presenters while in the audience, and using interview questions such as, how have you used humor in the past to manage conflict in a work setting? Besides hiring practices that screen for playful and creative people, new employees are attached to a mentor whose job is not simply to train them for the necessary job skills, but to model the types of attitudes, values, and associated behaviors the new hire is hoped to embody. Thus, from CEO Herb Kelleher throughout the various divisions of the organization, the mission and aesthetic dimension are not simply codified in formal trainings, ad programs, and newsletters, but also through informal messages, practices, and networks that are nurtured as locations of cultural manifestation. The reason it requires courage to create is because something new is a risk. The reason people shy away from risk is to avoid failure and unwanted consequences, such as punishments or stigma. The following exemplifies the response to failure as situated within the Southwest Airlines narrative. In 1985, Matt Buckley, the Southwest Airlines corporate cargo manager, proposed a same-day, door-to-door cargo delivery service called Rush Plus. In his business proposal, he promised a 50% revenue increase. He received approval. He designed a logo and an advertising campaign to promote the new service, and convinced division managers to cease using Federal and Express in favor of Rush Plus. And extra phone lines were installed to accommodate the anticipated business. Rush Plus was a total failure. And within a couple of months, the service ceased to exist. He assumed he would be demoted or even fired. Instead, his colleagues joked with him in a way that made light of the incident. Kelleher did not fire him, but approved 3 promotions over the years since the failure of Rush Plus, based on his observation that Buckley had turned failure into an opportunity for personal growth and maturity. This scenario, and others like it, take on the weight of legend and myth in their capacity to lift the haze of anesthesia and evoke the aesthetic dimension Bell Hooks calls the moment of experience, of human interaction, the passion or remembrance that serves as a catalyst urging on the will to create. If an organization wishes to promote creative risk-taking among its employees, it must demonstrate that it values risk by making risk meaningful within its various social performances. Southwest Airlines is not perfect, but as an example of a postmodern organization, it is descriptive of a culture where risk can be nurtured and directed towards organizational goals. Akhenaten is a history. The Alto computer is a history. Southwest Airlines is a living story. It is a story of the only airline to earn a profit every year since 1973, even during the 5 years of 1990 to 1994, when the industry as a whole lost $12.8 billion. And the living story of Southwest Airlines will remain viable as long as the patterns of behavior that naturally form in any organization do not calcify into unquestionable, rigid hierarchies, as long as company procedures are a flexible means to an end rather than an end in themselves. All people can be viewed as artists who must take creative risks in order to be fully human. Nevertheless, even artists realize the intrinsic limits of art. There are only so many notes on the musical scale. However, within the limits of notes, an astounding richness of musical expression is possible. Organizations cannot achieve global competitiveness without creative risk. But to promote success, they must also set limits and standards as well. In the next module, Dan Hopwood discusses the nature of planning contingencies that contribute to success, mitigate crisis, and maintain continuity needed to remain focused on the vision. Thank you.
Let's begin with the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which appear on your screen. We remind you to make your phone calls at a distance from the monitor to avoid feedback. Our first call is from Mexico. It is from the Universidad Liceo Cervantino in the city of Irapuato in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico.
From the university from Irapuato, the world capital of strawberries. Who determines the plans? ¿Aló?
Hello?
Hay mucha.
I think we've lost that call. Let's take the second call and we'll see if we can reestablish connection with Irapuato.
Vamos a tratar
Oh,
de.
never mind, here we are. No, we've lost contact with Irapuato. We'll try to get them back on the line. Let's take the question that's come in by fax from Cuba. It is from Señía Internet in La Habana, Cuba. The question is, and I'll direct this to Nigel. How does Southwest Airlines deal with employees that want to follow the old style of management? Nigel?
Well, one of the things that Southwest does is they screen out those types of employees that would want to naturally adhere to an old school of management. They do that through an interview process and a recruiting process which essentially celebrates risk, creativity, and thinking outside the box. A real clear example of this is an advertisement they had in a trade journal where you see a children's coloring book and a picture, a line drawing of a dinosaur, and there's all kinds of colorful crayon marks that go all over the picture and outside the picture itself. And there's a note from a teacher that says, "Billy, try to draw inside the lines." And then underneath the advertising text says, "Billy shows an early aptitude for working well with Southwest Airlines." This type of organizational message, which comes out of that type of culture, naturally predisposes people to select themselves to enter that type of a culture because they want to participate in that way of doing things. My wife has a friend who is a flight attendant with American Airlines, and she enjoys her work, but I asked her what her perception was of Southwest Airlines, and apparently it is well understood within the industry that Southwest Airlines is that type of a culture, that people do crazy things and creative things, and that's attractive to the type of people that want to participate in that type of a culture. So it's unlikely that people that are dead set on doing old school management techniques would want to try to get into Southwest Airlines in the first place.
Thank you. Our next question is from Colombia. It is from the Federación Nacional de Comerciantes, FENALCO, in the city of Medellín in Colombia.
Buenos días.
Our question is the following. The strategic planning facilitates decision-making and allows figuring out the future of an organization. How can we integrate this with risk-taking?
Nigel, strategic planning and risk-taking.
Well, strategic planning is really, I think, part of Dan's domain, but obviously, as I used the metaphor of there's only so many notes on a musical scale, certain parameters must be established and certain types of visions must be communicated clearly to the organization. But within those parameters, support for taking risks must be communicated to the employees if that's what the organization wishes to enhance. And additionally, I think one of the most important things that came out of my research is that when employees do engage in risks that do not necessarily produce immediate, profitable, or measurable results, they must not be punished or stigmatized for taking those risks. It must be understood as part of a learning process. And then perhaps Dan can talk to how those breakdowns may be contained within contingency planning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's one other thing that I would add to Nigel's comments in the context of leadership and strategic planning is the element of control. Planning, leadership, organization, and control are all elements of management, and it's the control piece that I think will help organizations get over that hurdle. And if you're going to be doing risky activities and taking risks, the control piece, especially in regards to how employees respond and react and help to manage operations, becomes increasingly important.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mexico. It's from the Instituto Politécnico Nacional de Educación Continua in Mexico City, Mexico.
Sí, buenos días. ¿Cómo equilibrar
How can you balance arrogance
cuando llegan directivos
when
nuevos
you have new people, new managers coming to a business organization, and they are very arrogant, and the arrogance in the productivity of the employees? How can we handle this?
Nigel, how does arrogance fit into this?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, it has to do with new management brought into an organization that have an arrogant attitude towards their subordinates as part of a strategy to get them to be productive, let's say. Unfortunately, of course, there's no calculating for individuality. There are different people are going to be different, so individuals may be arrogant. As far as a school of thought that says that a certain amount of arrogance or aloofness is productive to get employees to be productive themselves, I think recent research demonstrates that that's not true. Now, as far as how an employee would negotiate arrogance within the context of an organization, that's a sticky situation, especially if you're dealing with a superior who has a certain amount of power over you. I would say that communication skills are important in that area. Gaining support from your peers and looking at the organizational structure as a whole to see other areas where you may be able to seek remedy or support for taking risks or doing things that aren't under the direct oversight of this person who you may perceive as being arrogant. Again, that is an individual thing, but as long as the organization itself as a whole isn't arrogant towards its employees, I think that there are probably other avenues within a large organization to seek remedy.
Thank you. Our next question is from the Dominican Republic. It is from the Pontificia Universidad Católica Madre y Maestros in the city of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic.
I'm Maria Bisonó. What is the origin of that strength and productive competency? ¿Podría repetir la última parte de la pregunta? What is the origin of that strength and productive competence with which you define risk and you discard it as a genetic skill? That's our question. If you have an environment that promotes risk, and then you have the fact that a lot of families have, for instance, a lot of people whose behavior has a great risk-taking capability or ability and tradition, how do you explain all this?
Nigel, do you have a sense of the question?
I believe the question is, it has to do with origins, and reference to my comment that risk-taking is not something that is just genetically predisposed. The comment was, I believe, related to how does a culture manage risk if there is perhaps family life or cultural backgrounds that are not predisposed to risk-taking? Is that the understanding of the question? And if so, I'm assuming that basically, to some extent, that almost answers the question as far as its genetic nature. If it is a family life issue, then you perhaps are raised in a family where risk is not valued, and you carry those values, those beliefs, those attitudes with you into an organizational context. If you enter an organizational context where the culture there supports risk, your own attitudes, values, and beliefs are going to be altered, changed, and mitigated to some extent by participating within those social performances. So as far as origins go, I can't speak intelligently to that because, again, risk-taking is a product of human sense-making, which to me is always situated within a cultural context.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Mexico. We're going to hear from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la Facultad de Medicina Veterinaria y Zootécnico in Mexico City, Mexico.
Buenos días. Es la Facultad de Estudios Superiores Cuautitlán.
Oh, we're calling from Cuautitlán. This is not the medicine faculty. Good morning. I have a question for Dr. Nigel. Are risks part of any organization? Do we have to look for them, prevent them from happening, face them, or all three things at the same time? Thank you.
I think risks are always an inherent part of life. Even if a strategy is developed that says that we have set patterns of behavior that are historically situated and we replicate these patterns over and over as a way of dealing with the market, let's say, that in itself presents a type of risk. It's the risk that you will not adapt and will not change when you are confronted with a changing marketplace. So risk is not something that is escapable. It's something that can either be consciously engaged or it can be something that can be psychologically avoided and denied. But I believe it's an inherent part. And of course, complete risk is not productive either. That leads to chaos. So what we're talking about here is managed risk. It's developing patterns that are self-replicating, but then also having them be flexible so that they can be altered to change with altering marketplace situations.
Dan, would you like to add something?
Nigel hit that one on the head. There's not a lot I can add other than to suggest, and we'll hit this a little bit in my presentation, that risk in so many ways is an outcome, and you get to make decisions on what the outcome might be, whether it's acceptable or unacceptable. And if you see risk as an outcome as opposed to an inherent quality of activity, then I think you'll be more successful. And again, I'll touch on that in a few minutes.
Thank you. Our next question is from Argentina. It's from the Grupo Previsional Nación. It's from the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina.
Buenos días, le habla Oscar Mayor.
Buenos días.
La pregunta es la siguiente.
La pregunta adelante.
Necesariamente
This is the
la
question.
empresa debe
Does
estar
the
en
company
riesgo para
have
generar
to have a risk in order to generate amongst its employees a productivity climate and an awareness of assuming risk in a creative way?
Nigel?
Well, my comment to that would be that there are different levels of risk, and I think if you refer back to the psychologist Rollo May, to whom I mentioned in the speech, he talks about different types of courage, which is essentially equitable with risk. One of his courage criteria is social courage. Now, it may not be that a company is taking risk by launching new products all the time. That's just one definition of risk. But if the interest of an organization is to improve productivity and effectiveness within the organization, a certain amount of social risk is necessary on the part of leaders who must then develop empathy with their subordinates, must get people to see themselves as participating on a team, and empowering those employees. That requires a certain amount of risk. So, yes, I would say that if the decision is to rigidly adhere to a hierarchy, then that's going to normally produce less productivity than if all the people are engaged on many different levels. And even if it's just producing the same product or improving the same product over time, there is a social risk in getting people's input within the organization, getting them psychologically engaged in that process.
Thank you. We're going to go back and try to get Irapuato again, the Universidad Liceo Cervantino in the city of Irapuato in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico.
Bueno, buenos días. Hay ocasiones
There are times when
que se tienen varios caminos,
there are several paths to follow.
implican riesgos.
Some of those imply some risk. If I don't have enough time to analyze them, what would be the elements that I should take into account in order to take my decision about assuming or not assuming a risk, or how to act upon that risk?
Now, did you have a quick test when you're presented with various types of risk as to how you should deal with that?
Again, I think this is probably a question to which Dan would speak more intelligently. But again, from my own perspective, the one thing to keep in mind is that with any risk, there is the paradox of accepting the possibility of failure. And then with that, you just need to understand that there's a sophisticated form of cost-benefit analysis involved in taking any one of several paths. However, as far as specific strategies go, I think that's Dan's domain.
Dan, you have a specific strategy?
I think if you embark on activities that have some degree of risk that you are unprepared for, or you think